He had read every letter. 12 years of them, every birthday he missed, every promise he broke, every moment his wife had quietly stood between him and the son who was slowly forgetting how to need him. At the bottom of the box, one sentence had broken him completely. You taught the kingdom how to follow you. You never taught your son why he should. The room had gone silent in a way that wasn't ordinary silence. The kind that arrives after something breaks, and doesn't fade, because it isn't waiting for anything to fill it. For the first time in his life, Alpha King Kael Varros had no enemy left to fight. Only the truth. And the only thing left to do now was find his son, before it was too late. But Kael Varros was about to discover something far worse than guilt. His son didn't hate him. He didn't know him at all. The first thing Kael did after reading the final letter was go looking for his son. Not because he suddenly understood fatherhood. 12 years of absence didn't undo themselves in a single night, no matter how badly a man wanted them to. He went looking because, for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Not of an enemy. Not of a rebellion, or a battlefield, or anything that could be met with steel. He was afraid of losing something he couldn't fight his way back to. That fear followed him through every corridor of the palace, through sleepless nights spent staring at Evelyn's empty chambers, the letters still sitting on his desk where he'd left them, unmoving, waiting, each one a small private verdict he couldn't unread. At dawn the next morning, he walked to the Eastern training grounds, the same grounds where generations of future alphas had learned to fight, where Rowan now spent most of his mornings. The air was cold and sharp, ringing with the sound of steel on steel, the practice yard thick with the smell of sweat and turned earth. Near the far end of the field, Rowan was sparring against 3 opponents at once. Kael stopped walking. For a long moment, he simply watched, because the young man moving across that field no longer looked like a boy. He was tall now. Broad through the shoulders. His movements were precise, economical, the kind of controlled aggression that took years to build and couldn't be faked. A warrior. A future king. Everything Kael had ever wanted his son to become. And watching him hurt, because Kael realized, standing there in the cold morning air, that he hadn't seen any of this happen. Not really. It had all occurred while he was somewhere else, one campaign at a time, one missed year at a time, until the boy he remembered had simply become someone else without his father in the room to notice. When the session ended, Rowan lowered his sword, accepted a few words from his instructors, and then saw his father standing at the edge of the field. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rowan crossed the distance between them, polite, composed, exactly the way a prince was trained to approach his king. Your Majesty. The words landed harder than any blow Kael had taken in 20 years of war. Your Majesty. Not father. Not even his name. A title. A wall, built out of 2 words and delivered with perfect courtesy. Kael forced a smile. Rowan. His son only nodded, waiting, patient, formal, and completely unreachable. And Kael realized, standing there, that he had no idea how to begin. No idea how a father was supposed to start repairing 12 years of absence. No idea how to close a distance that hadn't been measured in miles. Finally, he managed, I thought perhaps we could have breakfast together. A small request. The kind fathers made every day, in families where that kind of request didn't need to be a request at all. Rowan considered it for a moment. I'm meeting with General Holt. The words were innocent enough. But something about them, about the name, again, always the name, settled into Kael like a stone. Perhaps later, then. Perhaps. Polite. Respectful. Empty. And then Rowan was walking away, leaving his father standing alone at the edge of the training field, feeling, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly helpless. The days that followed offered no improvement. Breakfast invitations, declined. Private meetings, declined. Hunting trips, family dinners, all declined, always politely, always with a perfectly reasonable explanation attached. And every single rejection felt strangely, painfully familiar. Because Kael recognized the pattern. It was his own. The same excuses, the same postponements, the same careful, well-meaning distance he had spent 12 years building, now turned back toward him with devastating precision. Only now he was the one standing on the other side of it. And it hurt far more than he had ever imagined it could. One evening, walking past the Royal Library, Kael heard voices through the half-open door. One belonged to Rowan. The other belonged to Darius. He stopped. Not intentionally, not at first. And then he listened. Inside, Rowan sat across from the old general beside a crackling fire, maps and reports spread between them. The two of them looked completely at ease with each other, relaxed, familiar, the way people are when years of small ordinary moments have worn all the formality away. "What would you do?" Darius asked, tapping a spot on the map, "if the northern tribes refused the treaty?" Rowan studied the parchment for a moment, then answered, clearly, confidently, the answer of someone who had clearly thought about questions like this before, many times, with this exact person. Darius smiled. Good. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. And something in Kael's chest tightened painfully, because in that moment he wasn't watching a general and a prince discuss strategy. He was watching a father and a son. And neither of them even realized it. The realization arrived with the force of a blow. Rowan didn't hate him, and somehow, that was worse than if he had. Hatred would have meant his son still cared enough to be angry. Hatred meant investment. Rowan wasn't angry, wasn't resentful, wasn't rebellious in any way Kael could have pushed against. He simply didn't know him. 12 years of absence had quietly turned Kael into a stranger wearing a crown, and strangers don't become fathers just because they happen to share blood. That truth followed Kael for days. Then weeks. And then, slowly, another realization rose up beneath it, one that was somehow even harder to face. The father figure in Rowan's life had never been Kael. It had been Darius. The old general had taught him strategy, leadership, discipline, patience, all the things a father is supposed to teach. And Kael had never noticed, because he had never been present long enough to see any of it happening. For a moment, anger flared, sharp, instinctive, and entirely misdirected. Not at Rowan. At Darius. It lasted less than a minute. Because the truth arrived right behind it, and the truth left no room for blame. Darius had never tried to replace him. Never manipulated Rowan, never undermined the family, never once stepped deliberately into a role that wasn't his. He had simply shown up. Every single time Kael hadn't, at tournaments, at training sessions, at quiet ordinary moments that, one by one, had built the kind of relationship Kael had spent his whole life assuming would simply wait for him. It wouldn't. Absence doesn't leave a space empty. It leaves it open, and life, eventually, fills every open space with someone. For years, Kael had believed relationships could be postponed indefinitely, that love could wait the way a kingdom could wait for the right season to go to war. Now he understood, with a clarity that came far too late to undo any of it, that relationships aren't preserved by intention. They're preserved by presence. And presence was the one thing he had never given. Winter passed. Then spring. Then summer, and with it came the kind of preparation the kingdom had been waiting decades for. The formal coronation that would publicly name Rowan heir apparent before the entire realm. Nobles arrived from every corner of the kingdom. Delegations crossed mountains and rivers to be present. The capital filled with banners, music, and the unmistakable energy of a kingdom about to celebrate its future. Beneath all of it, Kael felt only dread. Every attempt at reconciliation had failed. Every invitation, rejected. Every conversation, shortened before it could become anything real. And Rowan remained, through all of it, unfailingly polite, which somehow made each refusal worse than if he had simply shouted. One evening, Kael made one final attempt. A private family dinner. No council. No advisors. No politics. Just father and son, in the dining room where, years ago, a boy had once stared at an empty chair and asked why his father was never there. The invitation was delivered personally. The answer came back hours later, a short note, formally written, perfectly polite. I regret that I cannot attend. Nothing more. No explanation. No emotion. No opening left for anything else. Kael stared at that note for a long time. Long after the messenger had gone. Long after the candles burned down to nothing and the palace fell quiet around him. Because for the first time, he understood, completely, finally, what Evelyn had been trying to tell him for years. Relationships don't collapse in dramatic moments. They collapse in ordinary ones. One missed dinner at a time. One broken promise at a time. One quiet absence at a time, until the day there's nothing left to collapse. And now the consequences were standing directly in front of him, dressed in silver and crimson, preparing to be presented to an entire kingdom as the future of House Varros. Somewhere deep inside, Kael feared that the ceremony meant to celebrate that future was about to reveal something else entirely, the truth about its past. And if that happened, the consequences would not stay private any longer. The day of the ceremony arrived under a sky so clear it felt almost cruel. No clouds. No wind carrying the smell of rain. Nothing to warn anyone that anything was about to go wrong. The capital had been awake since before dawn. Bells rang from the upper district. Market stalls were wrapped in crimson and gold. Children ran through the streets clutching painted wooden wolves, and merchants opened barrels of sweet wine that had been saved for exactly this occasion. Nobles arrived in velvet and fur and silver chain, their ceremonial blades polished to a mirror shine. Every road leading to Varros Keep was packed with people who had come to witness history. And in a sense, they were about to. Just not the history any of them expected. The rebellion was over. The western territories had been subdued. The roads were safe, the grain stores full, the rival packs had sent tribute. Peace, real peace, the kind Kael had spent 20 years chasing, had finally arrived. Everything he had sacrificed for stood before him, complete and undeniable. And that was the terrible irony of it. The kingdom looked at all of this and saw triumph. Kael looked at it and felt nothing but dread. Not that anyone could tell. He had spent too many years mastering his own face for that. His posture was perfect. His crown sat steady. His black ceremonial cloak fell from his shoulders like a shadow stitched in gold, and to every person in that courtyard, he looked exactly the way an Alpha King who had never lost a war was supposed to look. Powerful. Victorious. Unbreakable. But beneath the crown, beneath the armor, beneath 20 years of carefully built myth, something cold was moving through him, because for the first time in his life, the danger wasn't standing across a battlefield. It was standing a few feet away from him, dressed in silver and crimson, waiting to be presented to the kingdom as its future. Prince Rowan Varros stood on the platform in the robes of the heir apparent, and the first thing Kael noticed about him wasn't his height, or the way the crowd's eyes followed him, or even the calm composure he wore like a second set of armor. It was how old he looked. Not taller. Not stronger, those things came naturally, with time. This was something else. The kind of age that came from disappointment absorbed early and often. From learning, far too young, not to expect too much from people who were supposed to be there. Rowan stood with his hands folded behind his back, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. Not nervous. Not excited. Not proud. Simply present. The way a young man attends a duty, not the way a son stands beside his father. Near the altar, the high priest moved through the final blessings. At the base of the platform, the defeated enemy king knelt in ceremonial chains, the banners of the rebel provinces lowered and folded behind him. The message was unmistakable, the war had ended. Order had returned. The future belonged to House Varros. The crowd believed it completely. Every face turned toward the platform carried the same expression, relief, admiration, expectation. They had come to watch a king confirm his legacy. They had no idea they were about to watch a father lose it. General Darius Holt stood near the edge of the platform, older now, silver threading through his beard, a scar pulling tight across one cheek. His shoulders were still broad beneath his commander's cloak, but there was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there years ago. He was watching Rowan. Not Kael. Not with pride, the way an ambitious man watches influence taking shape. Protectively. And that, more than anything else, was what made Kael's chest tighten, because Darius wasn't trying to take anything from him. He never had been. He was simply standing close to the boy, the way he had always stood close, every single time Kael hadn't. The bells rang once. The ceremony began. A hush rolled across the courtyard as the high priest raised the ceremonial staff. "People of Varros," he declared, his voice carrying clean across the stone terraces, "today we honor the end of division." Cheers rose, and he let them build before raising a hand for quiet. "Today we witness the renewal of peace." More cheering, louder this time. "Today we bless the line that will carry this kingdom forward." The crowd roared. Thousands of voices, thousands of raised hands, an entire kingdom celebrating a future it believed was secure. Kael kept his eyes on his son. Rowan did not smile. The priest turned toward Kael. "Alpha King Kael Varros, conqueror of the Western Rebellion, protector of the Eastern Roads, sovereign of the United Territories, do you stand before your people in victory?" "I do." His voice didn't shake. It never did. The crowd cheered again, and the priest turned to Rowan. "And Prince Rowan Varros, heir of the crown, blood of the Alpha King, future guardian of this realm." Rowan lifted his gaze. For one brief moment, father and son looked directly at each other, and Kael searched that gaze for something, anything. Anger. Pain. Longing. Some crack he could reach through. There was nothing he could reach. Rowan's expression wasn't hostile, and it wasn't warm. It was closed, completely, carefully closed, the way a door is closed when someone has decided, deliberately, not to open it again. That was worse than anything else could have been. The high priest smiled, entirely unaware of the blade already entering the room. "Step forward." Rowan did. One step. Measured. Controlled. The crowd applauded, and Kael felt his own pulse climbing into his throat. This was the simplest part of the ceremony. The heir would step beside the king. The priest would place one hand over Kael's crown and one over Rowan's shoulder, binding present and future in front of the kingdom. Simple. Symbolic. Harmless. Except nothing between them was harmless anymore. "Stand beside your father." The words moved across the courtyard like a command wrapped in ceremony, and Rowan stopped. Not dramatically. Not with any visible defiance. He simply stopped, 2 steps away from his father, close enough that the crowd could see them both, far enough that the distance looked, unmistakably, intentional. The applause softened. Then faltered. Then died completely. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. Perhaps the prince had misheard. Perhaps the moment had simply overwhelmed him. The high priest waited a moment, then said again, gently, "Your Highness." Rowan didn't move. Kael's hand closed once at his side. A small movement. No one in the crowd noticed. Darius did. His expression changed, not much, but enough. The old general understood before anyone else in that courtyard did. Maybe before Kael did. Prince Rowan. The priest's smile had faded now. Still nothing. And the courtyard fell into a silence that didn't belong to a crowd of thousands, a silence so complete that even the horses below seemed to stop shifting, as if the entire kingdom had inhaled at once and forgotten how to let the breath back out. Kael looked at his son. Really looked. And in that frozen moment, he saw every version of Rowan layered on top of the young man standing in front of him, Rowan at 6, watching the dining room door. Rowan at 9, holding a wooden sword too big for his hands. Rowan at 12, asking, "Will you be there this time?" Rowan at 13, placing a championship medal in a drawer because the one person he'd wanted to see it hadn't come. Rowan at 14, fevered and afraid in a bed his father never knew existed. Rowan at 15, walking beside Darius while his father rode away toward yet another border. All of it. Every missed moment, every empty chair, every promise that had been true the moment it was spoken and worthless by the time it mattered. All of it stood between them now. Invisible to the crowd. Visible, at last, to Kael. "Stand beside your father," the high priest said again, and this time it wasn't an instruction. It was a warning. The crown was watching. The kingdom was watching. History itself seemed to be holding its breath. Rowan turned his head slightly toward the priest. Then back to his father. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, not loud, not angry. That was exactly why it carried. "He's my king." The word struck the courtyard like thunder without sound. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd, nobles leaning toward each other, warriors frowning. Of course Kael was his king. Everyone's king. Why say it? Kael didn't move. Because some part of him already knew there was more coming. Rowan held his father's eyes. "But he is not my father." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that fills a space. It was the kind that empties one, that pulls the warmth out of stone, that makes thousands of people understand, all at once, that they have just witnessed something they were never meant to see. The enemy king still knelt. The banners still hung motionless in the windless air. The victory platform still gleamed under the sun. But the ceremony was dead. Not interrupted. Dead. The high priest's mouth opened, and no sound came out. Somewhere in the upper terraces, a noblewoman gasped. A ceremonial cup slipped from someone's hand and struck the stone, rolling in a slow circle, the scrape of metal against marble somehow louder than anything else in the world. Kael heard all of it. Every sound. Every breath. Every whisper that hadn't started yet but soon would, spreading outward from this courtyard until it reached every corner of the kingdom he had spent his life building. He had been wounded before. Steel. Claws. Arrows. Fire. He knew the body's entire catalogue of pain. This wasn't that. This didn't enter flesh. It entered history. It entered blood. It entered the small, private place where a man keeps the version of himself he still wants to believe in, and it shattered that place completely. Rowan didn't lower his eyes. That mattered. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd said, and he wasn't triumphant either. If anything, he looked tired, and that tiredness very nearly broke Kael more than anything else could have. Because anger would have been easier. If Rowan had shouted, Kael could have answered him. If he'd accused his father wildly, Kael could have defended himself. If he'd wept, Kael could have crossed the platform and held him. But Rowan did none of those things. He simply told the truth. And the truth had no handle, nothing for Kael to grip, nothing to turn aside. The high priest finally found his voice. "Your Highness, this is not the place." Rowan turned to him, calm. "It became the place when you asked me to stand beside him." The priest went still. So did the crowd. Rowan turned back to his father. "I respect the crown." Each word was careful, deliberate. "I honor the sacrifices made to protect this kingdom." A murmur moved through the rows of warriors. "I know what he built." A pause. A long one. Then, quieter, just slightly, "And I know what it cost." Kael's throat closed. Because through all the formality, through every carefully measured word, he could hear something underneath it now. Not loud. Not pleading. But there. The boy who had waited. The boy who had finally stopped asking. Rowan continued, his voice never rising, never breaking. A father is not only the man whose blood made you. The courtyard didn't breathe. A father is not only the man who provides a palace, a title, a future, or a name. Kael's vision blurred. A father is the man who stays long enough for you to know him. It landed with a kind of devastating simplicity, not poetic, not dramatic. Worse than either. True. A father is the man who teaches you to hold a sword, and then stays to ask if your hands hurt. Darius closed his eyes. A father is the man who sits beside your bed when fever makes you afraid to sleep. The crowd shifted, uneasy, not from boredom, but from recognition. Because somewhere, in some quiet private corner, everyone in that courtyard understood absence. Everyone had felt it, in some form, at some point in their lives. A father is the man who remembers what matters to you before the whole kingdom has to remind him. Kael couldn't breathe. Rowan looked at him then, not at the crown, not at the throne, not at the legend that every person in this courtyard had spent 20 years building in their minds. At the man. You protected the kingdom. His voice didn't break. I know that. A smaller pause. But you did not stay. No accusation could have cut deeper. No scream, no insult, no act of open rebellion. Just that. You did not stay. Kael tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out, because what was there to say? That the wars had been necessary. They had. That the kingdom had needed him. It had. That every decision had carried a weight that would have broken most men. All of it true. And none of it enough. That was the horror of it. His reasons were real. His love was real. His sacrifices were real. And so was the damage. Both things had been true, side by side, for 12 years, and neither one had ever cancelled the other out. Kael finally understood, completely, all at once, what Evelyn had spent 12 years trying to tell him. What her letters had recorded. What Rowan had lived through, one quiet day at a time. Love doesn't become present simply because it's sincere. A kingdom can be protected by an absent king. A child cannot be fathered by one. The high priest stepped back, no longer attempting to control anything, because some moments simply outranked protocol. Darius moved as if to step forward, then stopped, looking at Kael with an expression that held no triumph in it at all. Only sorrow. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to become the man Rowan turned to. He had simply been there. And being there had become everything. Rowan took one more step back, not far, just enough to make the refusal final. I will serve the kingdom, he said. I will honor the crown. Then, quieter, almost privately, though every wolf in that courtyard heard every word of it. But I will not pretend, for the comfort of a story that was never true. The words moved through the crowd like cold wind off the mountains. Kael stood on the victory platform, surrounded by everything he had ever fought for, the defeated enemy, the cheering people, the United Kingdom, the banners, the priests, the soldiers, the legacy that would carry his name for generations. And he had never, in 20 years of war, felt more completely defeated. Because at last, he understood. No speech could fix this. No victory could fix this. No power on earth could fix this. There was no enemy to execute. No treaty to sign. No battlefield left to win. No strategy that could make a son feel known by a father who had never been there to be known. Only time remained. If time was even willing to give him another chance. And as the kingdom stood frozen in stunned silence, Alpha King Kael Varros faced the most terrible truth of his entire reign. He had spent 20 years proving to strangers that he was worth following. And somehow, he had never once proven to his own son that he was worth calling father. The kingdom expected a response. That was the strange thing about public humiliation, people always expect a counterattack. A speech. A denial. A defense. Something. After all, Alpha King Kael Varros had spent 2 decades overcoming every challenge ever placed in front of him. Enemies, rebellions, famines, conspiracies, border wars, he always found a way through. He always fought back. He always won. But standing on that platform, with thousands of people watching and his son's words still hanging in the air like a blade no one had lowered yet, Kael did something no one in that courtyard had ever seen him do. Nothing. He said nothing, because for the first time in his life, he had no argument left. No strategy. No victory to claim. Only truth. And truth, it turned out, was an enemy that couldn't be fought. Especially when it wore the face of his own child. The ceremony ended in a silence that no amount of formality could fill. Officially, the priests completed their duties. The nobles returned to their estates. The delegations departed, and the city resumed its celebrations, because cities are very good at pretending nothing has happened. Unofficially, everything had changed. The kingdom had just watched a legend discover the one thing his crown could never command. Trust. The realization settled into Kael slowly, painfully, like sunlight finding its way into a room that had stayed dark for years. A crown could command obedience. It could not command trust. A throne could demand loyalty. It could not demand love. And fatherhood was not something a man earned through victories. It was earned through presence. So, for the first time in his life, Kael stopped fighting wars. Not because the kingdom no longer needed protecting, but because he had finally understood what else needed protecting, the family he had nearly lost completely, and whatever time still remained to do something about it. The months that followed felt stranger to Kael than any battlefield ever had. No armies marched. No enemies threatened the borders. Nothing required a strategy. War had rules. War had objectives. This had neither, only patience, humility, and consistency, none of which had ever been among Kael's natural gifts. 3 days after the ceremony, he found Rowan in the royal library, the same library where he had once stood outside a half-open door and listened to his son laugh with another man. Rowan sat alone, reading, firelight moving across the stone walls around him. Kael sat down. Without invitation. Without expectation. Without demand. Minutes passed before Rowan looked up. "What do you need?" "Polite." "Nothing more." Kael took a slow breath, and answered honestly, the way he should have, years ago. "Nothing." He glanced toward the shelves. "I just wanted to spend time with you." Rowan stared at him, clearly unsure what to do with a sentence like that. Neither of them knew what came next. Maybe that was the point. Relationships aren't rebuilt through grand speeches. They're rebuilt through uncomfortable beginnings, 7 awkward minutes in a library, most of it forgettable, except that when Kael left, something small had changed. A crack in the wall. Almost invisible. But real. Weeks became months. Kael kept showing up, not dramatically, just consistently. Family dinners Rowan sometimes attended and sometimes didn't, but Kael came anyway. Hunting trips that ended in silence, and others that ended in real conversation. Lessons that weren't about ruling at all, but about mistakes, fear, and regret, the things fathers are supposed to teach, and the things Kael was only now, for the first time, learning himself. The distance shrank. Slowly. Not because Rowan suddenly forgave him. Forgiveness had never been the real issue. Trust was. And trust doesn't arrive in a moment the way forgiveness can. It grows one kept promise at a time. One shown up afternoon at a time. One ordinary day at a time, repeated until ordinary stops feeling like something to brace for. 3 years passed. The kingdom thrived, borders secure, trade flourishing, peace holding. But for Kael, none of it mattered the way it once had, because somewhere along the way his priorities had quietly rearranged themselves. He still loved the kingdom. still served it, still protected it. But he had finally learned what Evelyn had tried to tell him years before any of this began. Leadership and family were never enemies. Only neglect had ever made them seem that way. The realization came too late to save the past. It did not come too late to save what was left of the future. That future arrived on a spring afternoon, 3 years after a prince had stood before his kingdom and refused to call the Alpha King his father. The gathering was small, deliberately small. No armies, no nobles, no priests, no politics. Just family, gathered in the palace gardens overlooking the eastern valley, the same gardens where a single question, asked beneath a maple tree, had once changed everything. Sunlight filtered through blooming branches. Birds moved through the trees. For the first time in longer than Kael could remember, the gardens felt peaceful. Truly peaceful. Evelyn stood near a flowering archway, older now, and somehow steadier than ever, still carrying the quiet strength that had held a family together long after it should have come apart. She smiled as Rowan approached. And for a moment, Kael saw the little boy again. Not the prince. Not the heir. His son. Except Rowan wasn't alone. Cradled carefully in his arms was a small bundle wrapped in soft wool, the newest member of House Varros. Kael's grandchild. The baby slept, tiny fingers curled against the blanket, entirely unaware of the history surrounding this moment, or how close it had once come to never happening at all. Rowan stopped in front of his father. Neither of them spoke right away. They didn't need to, some moments are too important for rushed words. Then the baby stirred, opened sleepy eyes, and reached out, a small hand searching the air. Kael extended one finger, almost without thinking, and the tiny fingers closed around it immediately. Small. Warm. Trusting. It hit harder than any battle he had ever fought, because trust had always been the thing he wanted most, and the thing he had spent his whole life trying to command instead of earn. His throat tightened. His eyes burned. The child squeezed his finger again, and for a moment, the Alpha King could not speak at all. Then Rowan smiled, a real smile, the kind Kael hadn't seen since his son was very young. The kind built from trust instead of obligation. He turned slightly toward the baby. Meet your grandfather. Grandfather. Not king. Not Alpha. Not your majesty. The word landed softly, and somehow carried more weight than every title Kael had ever held, because this one hadn't been given out of duty, or fear, or tradition. It had been given out of trust. Earned trust. The rarest kind there was. Kael lowered his head, no longer trying to hide what he felt. And for the first time in decades, the great Alpha King cried, not from grief, and not from defeat, but from gratitude. From relief. From finally understanding. He had spent his whole life building a kingdom meant to outlive him. Walls, roads, laws, victories, borders, all of it important. All of it necessary. But in the end, none of it was the legacy that mattered most. That legacy was the family he had nearly lost, and the family that, against every reasonable expectation, had chosen to give him one more chance. And as the baby held tightly to his finger beneath the spring sunlight, Kael Varros finally understood something that had taken him an entire lifetime to learn. A king is remembered for what he builds. A father is remembered for who he stays beside. In the end, only one of those is ever truly remembered at all.